Hey guys, welcome to Pour My Mods. Today we're doing something in my Mercedes SL500 that it drastically needs. If you're new to the channel, I got this 99 Mercedes SL500 and my grand master plan for this car, which may upset some people, is to basically make it as American as Fauxbody Mustang and drag car as possible. It's got to be somewhat capable and also enjoyable to drive, and in my opinion, the suspension on this car is not enjoyable to drive. Sure, it's amazing and comfortable. I'll give it that. But it doesn't handle good. It is super duper soft, comfy and cushy, which has its place. But in my opinion, it needs to handle a little bit better. It doesn't need to be super stiff, doesn't need to be riding on cinder blocks, but it definitely needs an upgrade. And I've had experience with these CubeSpeed coilovers in the past on a couple different vehicles. They offer great performance, but also daily drivability. It is worth noting that these coilovers are 32-way adjustable, so they do have a lot of adjustment in terms of dampening, but also the shock body is fully threaded, so there is a lot of adjustment for ride height also. We opted to go with the rubber isolated top mounts. We did not go with the pillow ball. That's gonna give us more comfort, and it's gonna be a little bit quieter, much more of a daily and street setup. So I'm looking forward to installing these. It should make this car handle a whole lot better and make it look good too. So let's get into it. Ow. Did that just snap? Dude, what? That snapped that easy? Guess we're not finishing tonight. That thing must have been hanging on for dear life. We're gonna keep this. I don't know what the fuck that.
Woo, back the fuck up, boy.
I'm in danger.
There we go. So I'm not exactly sure where to set these for the ride height that I want. Have no idea where that setting would be, but I think a good starting point is I'm gonna make this coilover an inch shorter than the factory strut. So we'll go ahead and do that. I have the bolt holes lined up in the bottom here. So we're just gonna try to make, you know, this flush surface here pretty much an inch below right here. Right about there, we're about an inch, maybe an inch and a quarter shorter than this factory shock. No idea where that's gonna put us, but that's what I did on the other side. We don't need to torque this down because I'm sure we're going to be adjusting this. But if you were to torque this down, which we will be in the future, 52 foot-pounds to torque this. So originally with this coilover setup, we went with an actual coilover setup from CubeSpeed where the spring is on the shock. But after getting that installed, we had issues in the front. The rear was a divorced setup, which is where the shock is separate from the spring. When we went with a true coilover setup in the front, we ran into clearance issues with the front wheels. The wheels hit the spring and there was about 17 millimeters of interference. And to get around that, I either needed a 17 millimeter wheel spacer, which I was not a fan of. So I reached out to Cube and told him about my situation, and he suggested that we go with the divorced setup in the front. So the car was down for a little bit, and Cube sent us the appropriate things to get the divorced setup to work in the front, and going with the divorced setup fixed our problem. So now that we have the coilovers installed, we have the appropriate things from Cube to make them a divorced setup. So now we're gonna take off the coilover, separate the spring from the shock, and reinstall it, and that's what you'll see in this part of the video. Here is the solution for the front. We have a different spring and then a adjusting collar that's gonna go on top of the spring, and this will bolt to the upper perch. Now this says specifically that this mounts on the chassis side, which I agree with for the front, but for the rear, that is not possible. We had to mount that in the lower control arm. Really no way around it. So I don't think I needed to show you this because you shouldn't be doing this. When you order the kit, it should be good to go for you. So I took the coilover spring off of this shock with the collars. We removed that. We are no longer using it. We are just using the shock strut, whatever you want to call this. And we have the new spring and adjusting collar. And now, before you install this, you need to get a very important measurement. To properly set this up, you need to know how much travel it has, and then we need to set it up properly eventually in the car. And so I got my full travel measurement here, 4.5 inches. So what I did, placed it against my workbench here and placed a line here, pushed it all the way in, and very quickly drew a line to where it stopped, and I got 4.5 inches. We will need to remember this measurement later on. We also need to do this same measurement for the rear. We need to get the total travel length, and then we're gonna properly set it up in the car because this is a divorced setup. So, now that we have our measurement here, we're going to install our spring with our adjusting collar and put the shock back in. Cool. Got my adjusting collars about halfway down, a little bit less than halfway down on this collar. Basically just barely sticking down past this perch. And we'll slide this guy in here. It does have a relief machined in here for a perfect fit, just like so. Getting this spring in could be a little fun, and this can only go in one way. One side of the spring is pretty flat, and the other side is not. This side here, that is just, you know, a regular coil. This is gonna go on the bottom. This flatter side is gonna go against the perch right here. All right, got the spring and adjusting collar installed and got the shock reinstalled. I don't think I need to show you how to do that. It was literally the same installation process that we did earlier, just without the spring being there. Now that we have the front corrected, let's go ahead, move to the back. All right, so we go in the trunk here, and got to take all this paneling apart so you can get access to that hole. And then, once you get into that hole, there is the shock mount with a jam nut and a regular nut. So, you need at least 2 17mm wrenches. I needed 3 different ones because they're all just slightly different, the amount of angle that they have. And the articulation that they offer, you need several different ones to get in there and just move, you know, pretty much one flat of the nut at a time. Now, we did not remove this. We decided to just endure a little bit extra suffering and just work through that hole rather than remove this. This panel is theoretically removable. So if you remove it, you get more articulation with the wrench, but removing it still doesn't really help you on the driver's side. Let me show you the issue with the driver's side. We have the coilover installed on this side. So not a whole lot of room in there. Not easy to work with, but it is possible. So yeah, I'm not gonna be able to show you removing those nuts, but basically the hardest one is on this side. We loosened the jam nut, but did not remove it. Then you loosen the other nut. That allows the shock to drop a little bit. Then you can take the jam nut off and continue on with the removal. Pretty annoying, but possible. I'm by myself, I'm in the trunk, and the shaft is spinning while I try to loosen the nut. So I'm going to do the unforgivable, since we're doing away with these shocks anyway. Let's see it spin now. There we go. Yeah. Yep. Worked like a charm.
I'm in danger.
All right. This shock all the way shortened at its max low. The shock body is still longer, slightly longer than the factory shock. So I'm not exactly sure what to do with this one initially. I haven't done this before. But what I did with the other side was made it about an inch longer from its max shortness. But then once we got it in the car, we had to manipulate this length a lot, either to get this thread to go further through the hole, the mounting hole, or to get it shorter. So we did a lot of manipulating of the shock once we got it in. So after our initial 1-inch adjustment, I don't even know where we went. But pretty much this first setup, we're putting it in the car and we're likely going to have to adjust it. The annoying part is it's not as easy to adjust the rear as it is the front. For the dampening, it's very easy. The passenger side, this can live inside the shock. There's plenty of room for this, but on the driver's side, there is not enough clearance for this to live in the shock. So if you have to adjust the dampening of the driver's side shock, you have to take it out of the car. Not ideal, but it is what it is. Or unless you take that device away that sits above the shock. So what I did, from my experience with these shocks, I know they like to be about pretty much in their mid setting for stiffness. So I went a little bit beyond that. I did 20 clicks of hardness on the driver's side. So I'm going to do that on this side, 20 clicks of hardness, but this can stay in the passenger side so we can adjust it in the car. As for the spring is height adjustable, and this lower perch will bolt into the lower control arm. So we take this bolt out here. This will go in from beneath the lower control arm. This will sit on top of the lower control arm, and this is where our height adjustment is. And we're gonna put this at max length because this is significantly shorter than the factory spring, and I'm not sure how it's going to react. So I'm just gonna set it to max height. Let's get this off of here. Gotta take off this top rubber bushing. All right, and this is gonna go in the car just like so. Might be a bit of a challenge since I'm alone, but let's get to it. Got the rear shock on this table to measure the full stroke here. And here is my mark for its full length, and at full compression, it is down here. So the stroke is 4.5 inches, just like on the front. As you can see here, the shaft is rotating with the nut, and I'm by myself, so we're gonna have to come up with a solution here. Look at that. I got it to hold. There's a teeny tiny bit of slippage, but I'm able to tighten the nut more than the shaft spins. And I used some clamps. I was able to get 3 wood clamps onto the shaft of the shock. Now don't worry, they all have rubber feet, so there's no metal to metal contact there. It's rubber feet gripping on the shaft. And it did take 3 of them to hold it. 2 of them was not enough. And now we're gonna attempt to get this in there, and we're gonna add 20 clicks of hardness because that's what I did on the other side. Unfortunately, there's no room for this, so if it needs adjusted, the shock's gotta come out. But it looks like there is room for this to live in there. I'm not gonna bother re-securing this sway bar end link because there's a great possibility that I have to come back in here and take this apart and make an adjustment anyway, so there's really no point in securing the sway bar end link. I do have the shock body secured to the lower control arm, and I do have the lower control arm to the knuckle bolt tightened. So everything is installed. Now it's time to put the wheels back on the car, put this thing on the ground, see what our measurements are for height, and go from there. Gonna be interesting, especially with where the adjusters are on these springs. It's gonna be a pretty tedious process, I'd imagine. All right, we got the car on the ground, and it's actually looking pretty good. So I'm measuring from the ground to the bottom of the fender here, and the front is actually level. We are at 25 1/8 on both sides. So we dropped the front 2 inches, a little low for my taste. And the rear is pretty damn close to stock ride height, pretty much stock ride height. So you can see here, 26 5/8, and now we're at 26.5, damn near stock ride height. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna get the car back up in the air. I'm gonna lift the front 1/2 inch, and then I'm gonna drop this rear 1/4 inch. I'm not gonna go too crazy because these wheels are gonna be coming off and I'm gonna be putting on those. So for now, I'm just gonna show you guys how to drop the rear 1/4 inch, raise the front 1/2 inch, and then we'll go from there. Unfortunately, the way the coilovers are on this thing, it's not easy to adjust. Pretty much the whole car's gotta come apart. In order to lower this collar here, there was just too much tension with the spring on there, so I had to drop everything all over again. So we lowered this 1/4 inch, and now we can reinstall everything, and hopefully that's where we want it. All right, the car has been sitting for a few days, and I got my new wheels on. It is looking So good. And I would recommend, before doing any crazy adjustments, you really do want to let the car settle a little bit, because you might end up changing some things after the suspension has settled. You might change the ride height again, which there's a little bit of tweaking I want to do with the ride height. But now that it's been sitting for a few days, we are going to adjust the shock length. I'm going to try to explain this as best that I can. And the reason we have to set the shock length is because this is a divorced setup. It's not a true coilover. This is just adjustable suspension. So once you get the ride height to where you want it, then you adjust the shock length. And basically what you want, the amount of droop that you have going from sitting on the ground, all four corners on the ground, to then lifting the car completely off the ground, all four corners, that amount of droop that you get, you want that to be 33% of the total length of travel of the shock. So for example, on the front here, our full range of motion is 4.5 inches. And so what I did, sitting on the ground here, I measured from the fender to the lip of the wheel, right here. Now, it doesn't matter exactly where you measure, as long as your measurements are the same, because you want to measure how much the wheel droops. So whether you measure from the fender to the wheel, the fender to the tire, the fender to the center of the wheel, it doesn't matter. Just make sure that you do it in the same place when you do it at ride height versus full droop. So what I did, I measured from this fender to the lip of the wheel right here. And I have 4 3/16 of an inch right here. So when we lift this car off the ground completely, all four corners, ideally, we only want it to drop 1.5 inches, because 1.5 inches is 33% of 4.5 inches. It's recommended that 66% of the shock's travel is there for bump absorption when going down the road. So since we have 4 3/16 of an inch of gap here, when I lift the car, we want to get that measurement again. And we only want that difference to be 1.5 inches. And we're going to adjust the shock to make that 1.5 inches possible. Now that the car is off the ground and at full droop, and oh boy, we are at 7 inches. So we're going to take this wheel off, and we are going to shorten the shock until we get 5 11/16 of an inch from here to here. Just turn this in about 1 inch. Once you get this in the location that you want, you're going to torque this lock ring down, and also the one on the spring, to 52 foot-pounds. This part can be a little tricky. It can be hard to get a torque wrench in there, but you definitely want to torque these to about 52 foot-pounds. I moved this a bunch. We'll get the wheel back on and recheck it. Got a long way to go. All right, that did take quite a bit of adjustment, and we got it right in the ballpark there. That is pretty darn close. So we got that front shock length adjusted. The total stroke, again, is 4.5 inches, and that's the same for all four shocks. So we want to make the adjustment to all four shocks to make the total droop just about 1.5 inches. Now the rear, I did run into an issue where I couldn't get it to 1.5 inches. I got it to like 1.75 inches, maybe a little bit more than that. I shortened the shock all the way, as short as it could possibly go, and I was just getting a little bit more than 1.5 inches of droop, but after driving it, there's absolutely no issue. So if you can't get it to exactly 1.5 inches, it's not that big of a deal, but the closer you can get, the better, because you really want all that travel to be for bump absorption. But I've put about 500 miles on this car, maybe even more since then, and I haven't had a single issue. I feel like I don't need to show you adjusting the other 3 shock lengths. It is the same exact process of what I just showed you. After getting our ride height dialed in, this thing has a bit of negative camber going on. I adjusted the front lower control arms. There are cam bolts or eccentric bolts on the lower control arm, and I put them to max positive camber, and that was not enough camber adjustment. There was still 2, maybe 3 degrees of negative camber up front, which is not my taste. And pretty much you have two options at this point. You can either opt for the camber plates with the coilovers and go away from the rubber isolated mount, or you can spend $600 on a more aggressive eccentric bolt and bushing kit for the lower control arms. I think it makes a lot more sense to go with a camber plate on the upper coilover. So I reached out to Cube and they sent me over a set of their camber plates. And pretty much if you're in the market for adjustable suspension for this car, I would absolutely recommend going with the camber plates right off the get, because like I said, I only dropped the front of this like 1.5 inches and it gave a lot of camber. After getting these camber plates installed, I set them to almost max positive camber, and the front camber is looking pretty good. It is, eyeballing it, it is at pretty much zero, maybe a tiny, like half a degree of negative camber. I think it looks really good. All right, let's take this thing for a spin. I have 20 clicks of hardness in the rear, 15 clicks of hardness in the front, and I've actually put quite a bit of miles on this thing. I have at least 500 miles on this suspension, and it is so freaking good. It still rides like a Mercedes. It's incredible. It's still comfortable, totally daily drivable. In my opinion, Main Street approved. You can drive this thing down Main Street and hit potholes, manhole covers, no problem at all. Super, super comfortable, but it did stiffen it up a little bit to give it some sport. It does feel a heck of a lot better. It still rides a bit softer than all my other cars, but it is still fantastic. It is such an improvement. It handles better, and it's still comfortable. So let's do some back roads, because that's what these coilovers are designed to do. They're meant for non-ideal roads. They're not meant for track conditions. So I'm just going to take it through these Pennsylvania back roads and see how it can do. Way less body roll. So much less body roll. Stock sway bar still. Stock sway bar still. It's just the suspension setup. And it takes bumps like a champ. It drives really good. Now, of course, everyone will have their preference on how stiff they want the suspension. Like I said, I put 15 clicks up front, 20 in the rear, and it feels really good to me. Some people might want it a little softer, but I think it feels fantastic. It's just sporty enough to have fun with, but it's still soft and comfortable and rides like a Mercedes. This road right here is absolute trash, and it just takes this roughness like a champ. I can't believe how good it still rides. Now, it is important to note that after you put a little bit of mileage on this, you want to recheck everything that you touched and retorque everything. I actually did run into a situation where I was getting a clunking coming from the front right corner, and I couldn't quite figure it out, but it was actually the locking collar for the shock that came loose even after I torqued it. So I went back and had to retorque it, and that solved that problem. But if you do put some mileage on this and you hear some clunking, just go back and recheck the torque of everything that you touched. And for me, it was that locking collar on the shock in the front. Just takes bumps like a champ. It's so good. Yeah, I love this turn. Little off camber turn here. So good. And the body roll feels perfect. I don't think I have to add sway bars. It drives so good now. Freaking love it. All right, guys, there you go. That is the CubeSpeed suspension setup on my Mercedes R129 SL500. Absolutely love it. It rides so much better now. I'm so glad I put the suspension on here. Not only does it look fantastic, but it drives so stinking good. So big thanks to CubeSpeed for making this video possible. If you guys are interested in a suspension setup for your Mercedes or any other vehicle, make sure you check out Cube's website. I'll have a link to that in the description down below. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope maybe you learned something, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.